Good morning, everyone. I think we have a quorum here, all the voting members present. We've got three presentations this morning. First, we're going to hear from the Commissioner for Higher Education with respect to their recommendations for higher education. Then we'll take the Medicaid forecast and the revenue forecast. We actually have them scheduled for 9, 10, and 11. And so hopefully we'll be able to stay on that schedule. If for some reason we happen to move a little faster, why we'll just continue into the next presentation, assuming that people will be here. So first we have the Commission with Teresa Lubbers and Matt Hawkins to make the presentation, the Commissioner and her Associate Commissioner. So thank you for being here, and we appreciate all your hard work in getting this ready for us. Obviously, in Indiana, higher education is always one of the top priorities, at least of the recent legislatures, and so we look forward to your recommendations, and we appreciate the work not only of your staff, but of the commission itself. I know you have an outstanding commission that are all volunteers, and this is one of the things that makes this particularly gratifying for us, that we have people that are experts and successful in their own right, that are willing to give of their time to add their thoughts to the recommendations that you bring to us. So thank you for being here.
Mr. Chairman, good morning. Pick up where we left off last time we were with you last week. The first chart, you'll see that this chart to the right, it shows what you have in front of you. So while he's working on that, last week we came with our presentations, which were our financial aid, also the other higher education line items. The rest of these we will be presenting today, and that will include our operating recommendations, line items, recommendations for capital projects, repair and rehabilitation, and we will make a comment about the process that we'll use to set tuition and mandatory fee targets, which we do after the budget passes. I'm going to ask Matt to spend just a brief bit of time providing a little context for you, because we use this information to help us as we look at whether we are setting reasonable targets, acknowledging cost of living, and so we look at several indices, of which you can see all of these in front of you. Matt will just briefly explain the numbers associated with those.
Thank you, Commissioner Lubbers. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. We looked at many different indices over different periods of time, 1 year, 2 year, 3 years, and 5 years. We're presenting the 2-year here because it's a biennial budget. The first thing is CPI-U, which is Consumer Price Index Urban. And you can think about urban as just being any area with the infrastructure to report to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, so that is almost all-encompassing. CPI less food and energy, we've looked at that for many years. That tends to be a little more volatile than the other indexes because you have OPEC supply disruptions, things like that to factor in. Education and communication, that includes tuition, books, IT, software, telephones, things like that. CPI Midwest, that includes all the states in the Midwest, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, Michigan, Minnesota, Missouri, Nebraska, North Dakota, Ohio, South Dakota, and Wisconsin. HECA is the Higher Education Consultants Association. This is an index for cost charged to universities. So it would have cost for adjunct faculty members, things like that. HEPI is the Higher Education Price Index, and those are prices charged by institutions.
And your chart is a 2-year change, so this is not an annual percentage change. This is the change over the 2 years, so the annual rate of change would be about 1.65, for example, on the HEPI. Is that correct? Okay.
And I think the 5-year was 5%, 5.89, I think.
For the whole 5 years.
Any questions about that? We just really wanted to provide that for context. The next chart, I know you know this, but we thought it was worth making sure that newer members, although there aren't too many new members in this group, we're familiar with this. So much of what we do is based on appropriation per FTE. And sometimes, especially people who aren't on the budget committees, aren't aware of the difference between headcount and FTE. So we wanted just to make sure when you look at these numbers, you have a full understanding of that. I know Matt's had a chance to talk to some of you, but this is a very simple explanation of the difference between a full-time equivalent and a headcount. A headcount would be an enrollment regardless of whether the student went to school for 1 credit hour or, and a full-time obviously is someone who is full-time. So you can see the example that we used at the bottom. Shelley attends college part-time at 8 credits. That's a 1 head count, but a half of an FTE, compared to Keith, who goes full-time at 15 hours. So that's a full FTE and 1 head count. So when you look at these numbers on appropriation, we do appropriation per FTE, and that is the metric that is used as you look at higher education across the country as well. The next chart is important to look at as we consider trends and we plan for the future. And this shows a resident FTE count that shows that it's flat and declining. These numbers are always, they're clumped together in great measure, so they're a little hard to read, but I think you'll be able to tell that in the case of most institutions, you've seen essentially flat, although you do see some downward cycles happening, especially at Ivy Tech, which would be reflected at community colleges around the country. They tend to be more volatile in their enrollment based on what's happening in the economy. Economy picks up, people go back to work. So you see that change. The good news, bad news for this is it's not good for us that enrollment is going down. But in terms of appropriation per FTE, when it goes down, appropriation per FTE actually goes up, obviously. So we thought it was important to look at that as well. We looked at several, what we refer to as guiding principles as we put together our recommendations. We wanted to partner with you in the strong commitment that you have shown to student financial aid. It's important to look at the institutional side of higher education funding and then the individual side. At a time when we're telling students that higher education is more important than ever, we need to make sure that students can afford to access higher education. And we talked about that at length last week. Overall, we wanted to maintain the state's support for higher education as an investment in the state's economy and in the people who live in this state. These are no longer in the 21st century. Can you access the middle class with less than a high school diploma, and in many cases you need some sort of quality degree or credential beyond high school, and that is increasingly so. We looked at these inflation indices to actually inform how we would make our recommendations, and then we always try to align our recommendation with our strategic plan. I think one of the great benefits that Indiana has over many other states is that we operate with a strategic plan for higher education, and we stay true to it in everything that we're doing. It's the guiding principles we used for that was to build a system of higher education that was student-centered but mission-driven, acknowledging the different missions of our institutions and workforce-aligned. And then the tactics that we use to achieve that is to increase completion, productivity/affordability, and then always to maintain our focus on academic quality. So now we come to our recommendations that we offer to you today. For fiscal year 16, and we talked last week, even though we didn't make our presentation on operating, I did spend some time talking about performance funding, so I won't go through that today. But we've shown a slow but incremental increase in our support for performance funding. We are currently at 6% per year. The commission had voted in favor to move that to 7% for fiscal year 16 and 8% for fiscal year 17, with a recommendation that it would be in 16 a 4% reallocation of the base and a little over 3% new dollars, and in fiscal 17 a 5% reallocation of the base and a little over 3%. And you can see the amount that would be. For fiscal year 16, it would be $83 million more than fiscal year 15, and for fiscal year 17, it would be $95 million more than fiscal year 15 for performance funding. Once again, keep in mind that this is, as we showed last year, that performance funding is a little over 4% of the total amount of annual higher education funding.
So what do you add in there to the 7 and 8% that brings it down to 4.4 for the total? What are additional things are in the denominator that reduces that percentage? Is that the student aid component, or?
Yes, all the other components. If you add debt service and student financial aid.
Debt service
Yeah.
and student aid.
All of that together, it brings it down to
Okay.
4.4 of the total.
But then, I guess we'd say it was 7% and 8% of the operating appropriation. Would that be correct to say that? Okay.
That's why the number looks a little odd at the 3.23 and 3.26 as opposed to.
And you're just, this is always an important part of your recommendation. So, we're taking a 4 and a 5% reallocation of their current base recommendation, and then the other share would come from an increased recommendation of increased funding. Am I saying it correctly? Okay.
We think, you know, Commission has had a commitment to, regardless of the funding for higher education, we believe that performance funding matters, and so we've continued to show a commitment to performance funding with new and a reallocation of the base. But this is, you know, I don't like the terminology that you lose dollars with the reallocation of the base, you earn dollars with the reallocation of the base. So it's not that there's less money there, it's that it has to be earned through the metrics.
And one more point, and maybe that there will be more discussion this later in your presentation, but the 3.23% of new dollars for 16, and then the 3.26% in 17, it looks like that is not a compounding of that increase. For example, from when you move from 16 to 17, it's not another 3%, it's just the carryover from the first increase. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
I'd be happy to answer any questions about performance funding or that. If not, we'll move on to our recommendations for line items. The Commission is recommending that we fund the previously existing line items. This excludes some line items that were put in the last budget session, which are indicated here because those were rolled into base funding for those particular institutions. But with the exception of that, recommending that you fund existing. We're not recommending any new line items, of which there were a couple pages of new line item requests. And we're basically saying that if the previous line item request was in excess of what we are recommending for the operating base, we would give them just what the operating base, no more, so the 3.23 or whatever. So we're rolling the same increase into the existing line items that we rolled into operating.
Okay.
We're funding dual credit at the current $50 per credit hour, so there's no change in the per credit hour, although you will notice that this is a significant increase in funding because of the increase in dual credit. I think it's important to mention that dual credit saves students money when they are able to access higher education with credits before they begin. Our hope is that more of them will graduate on time or even in a more timely manner, less than 4 years or 2 years. So yes, there is a cost to the state for this, but it also can be a savings to the state over a period of time. We committed to making sure that we follow the success of dual credit students, but this is an increase that we needed to note here.
So just to be clear that I'm tracking with you here, the funding rate of $50 per hour hasn't changed, but there had been more dual credit gained or used than we were paying for. Is that right? And we are
They're actually turning into us this time that they actually are producing, yes.
right. So we're going to pay for what shows to be a trend of growth of the request for numbers of hours in dual credit. Is that right? Okay.
Recall that we allow the institutions to charge no more than $25 per credit hour for what we call the priority dual credit courses, and Ivy Tech is continuing at this point to not charge for dual credit.
Okay, so can we get a record of the past year or two, and then maybe a projection of where we are on how much dual credit each institution has offered and what we expect to be compensating them for going forward, so that we can just see that in a little more detail? That's not necessary today, obviously, but just so we can get the feel of the picture on that. Can we do that?
Exactly the right thing. It's sort of back to the question that Senator Talion had about 21st century and being able to predict what's happening earlier. We know that we're seeing, an increase in what we call early college models, and certainly with the expectation and the requirement in statute that schools offer both AP and dual credit. There's a state statute that requires that. We're going to see increases, I think, but let's see how we can work with the colleges and universities to see how they're anticipating doing that. Some are obviously providing much more dual credit than others.
Okay, thank you.
And then finally, the Build Indiana Funds dedicated funds are funded at the requested level, and none of them exceeded what our operating increase was. The only exception to this is the MEC, which is the Midwestern Higher Education Compact, which increased a small amount. It went from 95,000 to 115,000. It's important to note, if you're not familiar with MEC, this allows our colleges and institutions to benefit from cooperative purchasing and buying. Over the course of our involvement with MEC, colleges and universities have saved millions of dollars. We still are, MEC is, the Midwestern Compact is still the lowest of the 4 national compacts in terms of what the state pays for that. It's a good bargain for us.
Senator Talion, I think, has a question.
Thank you. Commissioner, you've got here that you're not recommending any of the newly requested line items. I think it was every budget from every university, they had sort of new program line items that were outside of the operating budget. I think I was asking almost every one of them, what is that, and what's new, and why is it a separate line item? Because it sort of seemed to me that a lot of these new line items are really new programs that ought to be in operating. But are you saying that you're not recommending any of those?
That's correct. We're just the current line items that you have approved in the past. We're recommending that you continue, but it was the commission's belief, both staff and members, that in fact they were in great measure exactly what you said, parts of the operating budgets of the institutions, which would come through the operating as opposed to line items. So it was our belief that we would rather try to put any additional funding in the overall operating budget as opposed to line items that could be construed as things that should be in the operating budget.
And then those things wouldn't, if they were separate line items, they wouldn't be subject to that holdback for the performance funding?
And they also, well, line items did have holdback too, so they could have, but they also benefit only in individual institutions. So as opposed to an overall funding increase for operating budgets, which could benefit all of our institutions through performance funding, line items benefit only those institutions that the line item addresses. And they were subject, I mean, I think that's right, isn't it, Brian? They were subject to the reversion too.
Oh, to the reversion, but not to the performance funding
Oh, I'm sorry, I
holdback.
misunderstood. You're correct. Yes, they were subject to the reversion, but they are not a part of performance funding. They're outside of performance funding.
Okay, thank you.
And let's see, following on Senator Talion's comment, a number of the presentations talked about needing money for counseling or providing services to a different type of student that wasn't used to being in a higher education institution, and they thought it was going to take more of that kind of effort in order to get them to succeed. And several institutions made comments or requests along those lines. And so the assumption that the commission has made is that that's part of your regular operating charge. And so that's would be primarily why you're not recommending it as a separate amount, new line item.
We would rather put the money into overall funding for operating.
And then we talked about that the funding for the previously existing line items, and there's, I just looked at one as an example, the IPFW $2 million. And as I look at this submission sheet, as it's been crunched through the budget agency's computer format, I can't tell that that's been added to the base there, so you probably need to circle back later and explain to me if that relates to somehow the performance funding bases and things like that. So we can follow up on that later, but I'm seeing it in other places, but I'm not sure I'm seeing it there, okay?
We'll certainly make it clear, because those items that are called out, were actually obviously rolled into their base budget
Right.
now. So in that sense, it could be subject to performance funding if it's a reallocation of the base, but it was not put in as a line item. It was put in as their base budget.
I take your, the things on the screen as being the representative of what it is you're attempting to do, and I'm just not following it on these numbers, so I just need a follow-up later on that.
Next, we come to capital projects, and as we have in the past, we ask the colleges and universities to prioritize their capital projects. And we concluded that what we wanted to do was to focus on what they said were their priority one projects, and to focus on, as you have asked us to do in the past, the maintenance of the buildings, the deferred maintenance of the buildings. And in particular, you'll find that the projects that we're recommending improve the academic space that's needed for campuses. We also considered the impact that capital projects would have on student fees and what that would do to the debt service load. And then we tried to maintain this sort of rule of thumb that we use to keep overall debt levels near the 10% of operating funds. And so we've been able, that's what we use to guide the recommendations that we're making. As you will see on the next page, there were 31 projects that were recommended to us by the colleges and universities that would have totaled over $761 million. By recommending, which the commission is doing today, the 7 priority ones, that is $285 million with a debt service per year of $22 million.
I think Senator Talion has a question here at this point.
Thank you. Okay, we also made a list of all, just trying to sort them all out. And you're taking the priority one from each institution, correct?
System, yes.
So that leaves every regional campus of IU and Purdue out.
No, if you'll look at the next, I mean, it could, but if you look at the next page, we actually, well, we don't have any.
No, I think the Purdue priority one is almost always a West Lafayette project, and IU priority one is almost always a Bloomington project. So any of the regional campuses who might be on status number 2 or 3, they're just out if you take this approach.
But keep in mind, Indiana has a system where the boards of trustees make the decisions about how to run the colleges and universities as a system, and we take their recommendations, and this is what they brought to us. The other thing is you start to divide the baby, and you decide which of those regional campuses, we decide which of those should do it. We are probably not completely equipped to do that, to go regional campus by regional campus and conclude that. If we would move above, if we didn't keep that 10% as a rule of thumb that we use for debt levels, and if we were willing to go higher than $22 million a year, it would allow us to, in fact, do more than that. But the same could be said for Ivy Tech, in which case, with all of their campuses, they received, their priority was one campus. Now, they're going to present to you, each of these institutions will no doubt present other projects to you. This is the recommendation made by the commission in order for us to keep our recommendations somewhat fiscally sound going forward.
And when you do the overall debt levels of 10% I'm just talking IU and Purdue because of the regional campuses. Do you count each of the regional campuses separately in terms of their 10% debt load, or do you count Purdue overall with all of its campuses as one unit?
We average all of them in, and the 10% is statewide. So it includes all 16 locations, with Ivy Tech being one.
So the region, if a regional campus doesn't have any debt, but the rest of that system does,
That's true.
it's still sort of
That's
too
true.
bad.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I do appreciate the commission's establishing a benchmark recommendation with respect to the debt level as a percentage of operating. I think that's, I'm glad that they have, we can argue about what it ought to be, but I'm glad they have set a number there.
If you look at the next page, you will then see what the priority one projects were. You'll see a great variance between, Ball States and Indiana State at extremely high levels. If you need to kind of go back and look at other years in order to get a sense of this. In other years, other institutions received a building or a project at a higher level. I think most of you have had a chance, probably with your visits around the state to these institutions, to hear from them about these projects. For example, at Indiana State, the College of Nursing, Health, and Human Services, a very compelling presentation about the need for that particular building at Indiana State to meet the services and what that they have. And so we had a chance to go to the institutions and hear their presentations as well, and it was from those and from their prioritization of the projects that we bring to you these recommendations today.
Well, this is why it's great to be in the General Assembly, because we get to listen to all the universities and all their legislators explain to us why we're 100% wrong with these recommendations. But we appreciate you distilling this down to the point that you have.
Well, the challenge, of course, that, I understand the places that you are, but the challenge is, what is the overall commitment to higher ed going to be, and where are we going to put the money? In the best of all worlds, I mean, we would love to be able to fund many more of these, and in fact, there's a compelling case to do that. But the challenge we have is, where are we going to put our money? And
Right.
we think that the operating budgets continue to be where we should spend the bulk of our money.
Well, I think our best response to that is to look at where we are today and what kind of shape and condition our universities are, both physically and in their operating costs compared to other places. And I feel pretty comfortable saying that Indiana's made a strong commitment here, and that we have very fine universities with good facilities for the most part. And we want to keep it there, but that's the benchmark that we've set, so I think we'll continue to work in those ways.
Why the next chart, I think, in keeping with what you're saying about repair and rehabilitation, has been so important as well. Much like the legislature has shown support for capital projects, you've made it very clear that you want us to take good care of the buildings and to focus on supporting the maintenance and upkeep on our buildings. So basically, we're bringing to you the same recommendation we had in the last budget cycle, which is to recommend state support at 0.5% of each biennium. But you will note that even at that, that's going to be 11.5% increase in overall funding. So we're using the same formula at the same percentage, but it does drive more money to repair and rehabilitation. Clearly, it's a small drop in the bucket for what actually the deferred maintenance currently exists at $1.8 billion. So this is another way that we try to balance our overall recommendations.
In your conversations with the universities on that point, are they in agreement with having the repair and rehabilitation as an identified item so that we can make sure that these get done? Do they seem to agree with that approach to this?
Yes, they do.
Okay.
The next page shows you the overall higher education budget. Each of the different component parts are recommendation. It shows the 15 appropriation and then the change from 15 to 16 and the change from 16 to 17.
And I would point out that the line item increase is predominantly due to dual credit.
Does the capital that you mentioned to me play into this?
I'm saying about
Yeah. We thought that it could be that yeah. Okay. We thought that actually your numbers might be a little bit overstated because you had $22 million for capital each year, And the way we normally go through the approval process, a lot of times those don't show up till the second year. And so you might kind of recheck that just to see, so we can get the accurate picture. I think, I'm sure that Budget Director Bailey's going to want to kind of sort that out for his budget presentation.
And we did have questions about that. The commission members went back to the past, and every year we've recommended it was split in half. So we can push that into the second year.
Sure. Well, I think that's a call to be made, and we were just noticing it looks like maybe he might have done a little differently. Yes, and Representative Gooden?
Good morning. Hey, I was looking at and you may be getting ready to touch on this, but with the 21st Century Scholars there, you had said that in the chart you're saying an increase, but then with the caveat with the box there, it says Scholars is held flat. Can you kind of explain that?
Yes, we had sort of a discussion last week. This is the 2.9% increase includes the line increase outside of 21st Century, so the other programs.
The return and complete predominantly.
And we presented last week a $9 million a year program that would really try to address the needs of part-time students and increase what we call a return and complete, trying to go after those students who have some college and no degree, which we figure we have 737,000 of those. So that would be included in that. We have struggled to figure out exactly the right way to articulate the 21st century because it is an entitlement. And at this point, as we talked about last week, we have an obligation based on what the statute says to meet the terms of that. So there will be a need to look at exactly what that's going to cost when you make your decisions about financial aid.
All right. I'll get with you afterwards because I was still kind of confused about what we talked about last week and then with the way that's reading here.
But we held flat for our financial aid for the Frank O'Bannon program, which is Freedom of Choice, and the Higher Education Award fit under Frank O'Bannon, and that was a flat recommendation. Most of our veterans programs were flat recommendations. We spoke to this as an entitlement, and then we recommended this new program, which is the Return and Complete program.
Yeah. All right, I'll get with somebody
Okay.
and figure it out. All right. Thank you.
If there are no other questions on that, we'll move to the next chart. We just wanted to show you that this is, keep in mind, this is a chart that has to do with resident FTE. This is the funding for FTE for the past 5 years, just to give you some perspective. As you know, post 2008, 2009, with the downturn in the economy, we saw a downturn over the course of several years in funding, and we're ticking back up in terms of our appropriation per FTE to almost the levels before that. There's been some slight adjustment in which schools, the standing to sort of right-size institutions in the appropriations per FTE, and we've been working on that for years. But we thought it was important for you to see exactly what those numbers would be to give you some idea of overall funding per FTE.
And this chart is the operating appropriations only.
Yes,
Correct.
that's correct. This is
Okay.
just operating per FTE.
And it's interesting how this somewhat parallels the K through 12 appropriations. If you look at it, that's a comparative number.
Finally, we'd be happy to take any other questions, but we wanted to just remind you that as a part of our statutory charge, effective, I think, 3 budget cycles ago, you've asked us to set non-binding targets for tuition and mandatory fees. We do that immediately once the budget is passed. We obviously will have conversations leading up to that before. This has been an attempt for us to really shine the light on this affordability issue and the relationship between what state supports institutions and what students and families pay for higher education. Last year, our last budget cycle, our recommendation is that our colleges and universities increase tuition by no more than CPI or no more than 2%. Most of our institutions came in. Some, as you know, Purdue, West Lafayette has frozen their tuition for 3 years now. A couple came in above that. They were institutions that were lower funded institutions. But we wanted to give you some context for that. this year, we'll also use this as an opportunity for us, and I'm not going to talk in this great detail, but different institutions charge differently. Some charge a flat fee, and some actually charge by the credit hour, which has an implication if you're trying to get students to take 15 credit hours and you pay for the additional credit hour at Ivy Tech, for example, that's a cost. If you have a banded tuition where you pay the same thing, if you take 15 or 18 credit hours, it's different. So we will be using this as an opportunity to work with our colleges and universities to see if what the implications are if students pay by the credit hour or they pay a flat fee, and what the implications are for on-time completion at those schools as well. So just wanted to bring that to your attention. And then in summary, we are obviously coming to you with a recommendation for an increased investment in higher education. We think this will continue the incremental financial support per resident, FTE, that we've seen, and it will continue to show a strong support for student financial aid. A modest but increase in capital investment and maintenance of facilities, and then this target funding for, as I mentioned to Representative Gooden, for the Return and Complete initiative that we're talking about. Our goal is that we hope that the next budget cycle, much like this budget cycle, we will be able to come to you showing the improvement that we've seen in degree attainment and on-time degree attainment, and the fact that more of our at-risk students are accessing and completing college. We're producing more degrees in areas that we need, especially STEM degrees, and we're keeping college affordable for more Hoosiers. With that, Mr. Chairman, we'd be happy to answer any questions. Just before I do that, we also provided to you, we are not at this point going through each of the colleges or universities, but you have the information exactly what their line item they received, how much they received in performance funding. I would mention when you look at this, you need to remember when you look at some institutions at the bottom line in terms of their funding, they may show a decrease. In nearly all of those cases, it's because of debt service coming offline. So if you look, example, at IU Northwest, IUPUI, Purdue North Central, and for the second year of IPFW or USI, you see a decrease in their overall funding, but it's related to debt service coming off. It's not related to them receiving less money.
Okay.
So you need to look first at that number above, which is their operating, and nearly all of our institutions are receiving an increase or nearly a flat. And overall, the overall funding, nearly all of our institutions are receiving an increase in overall funding.
Chairman Brown,
Thank you. A series of questions, if you don't mind.
please.
On dual credit, is there any institution that has more dual credit than another and therefore would benefit from our increasing of dual credit money?
I would say that Ivy Tech has the most dual credit, but they also don't charge students for dual credit when the other institutions don't charge the $25. So they do more dual credit. And you see some of the regional campuses that are more committed to dual credit. So some will benefit more based on if they've embraced that as a part of their mission.
And the performance, we've increased it over the years in the budgets to now you're wanting to go up to 7 to 8%.
Correct.
Is there a philosophy of what that top is or how much of a percent? Will we see in 2 more years it want to push up to 10%, or has there been that discussion?
We've not had the discussion about what would be the top level of performance funding. I think we've had the discussion that at this point, the metrics that we have and incremental change in that are still meeting our needs. We do think that there might come a time when, and hopefully there will, when our completion and our on-time completion reaches a point where the metric might need to be readjusted. Some states have, Tennessee and some other states have moved to 100% performance funding. That's not been the philosophy that the Commission has advocated. We've advocated that the levels that we are promoting actually are driving change. If you ask the college presidents whether or not performance funding matters to them, I think you've heard that it matters to them. And so you need to do enough that it actually is significant, while also giving them an opportunity to adjust to the incremental change. We believe that we're on that right course. I'm not prepared, actually, Representative Brown, to tell you whether 10% is the right amount, and we have not had that discussion yet. We've, at this point, gone cycle by cycle to figure out, do we have the right metrics, and do we have the right amount for this budget cycle?
Does the commission have an opinion on the governance of IPFW?
We have certainly worked with IPFW. We have not taken a position as to whether it should be governed by IU or Purdue. Our philosophy has been that we think that our regional campuses need to be increasingly places of first choice for more students, and that they need to have that recognition. We've changed our policies so that, for example, we allow graduate programs now. Even a doctoral program has been approved at a regional campus, which was not the case before. So we've changed our policies. The commission has not taken a position about whether they should come under one governance structure or remain the way they are. We're watching very carefully, and we're talking with our colleagues at those institutions, but we do not have a position.
Would you care if the legislature mandated you to study and come up with an opinion over the summer? How would you?
Well, we'll do whatever the legislature asks us to do, and we certainly have been doing that based on, there were a couple years of meetings that we've been meeting since the last budget cycle. We've presented the data, we've presented as much as other examples of other states, how they do regional campuses, and we'll continue to be as responsive to both legislative requirements and what we think is, a good structure for those institutions. I mean, our regional campuses are increasingly providing a very important service to our students, and we need to make sure that they are considered as a first place, not in a secondary way. So, and we think that the last couple of years have really been it's been a good time for us to actually look at the regional campuses. It's enabled us to say, what is it that we can do better at our regional campuses? What is the right mix of degrees that we provide there? The other thing that's enabled us to do that has been the creation of a community college system, where we've refined the mission between two-year institutions providing associate degrees and four-year institutions. So, my answer to your question is we'll do whatever you ask us to do, and we're continuing to try to be very responsive to requests.
And then maybe a little nuance issue, a couple of nuance issues. Purdue is combining the administrative structure of Purdue Calumet and Purdue North Central. Will we in the future see that line item combined?
I've met with the chancellors of both. They came and met with us at the commission a few weeks ago, and they, again, are doing this in a very evolutionary manner, in a collegial way with the faculties of both, but I think you are seeing an increasing integration of those two campuses. I don't think they have determined whether it would come as one request in the future, but they've done an excellent job bringing those two campuses together, sharing missions wherever they are, and still providing some distinct services at each of those campuses as well. But I don't think that decision has been made yet.
Yeah. Well, and lastly, I, like you and others up here, abhor debt, and we tried to show that in the last budget, and we'll continue to push in this budget of abhorring debt. But you talk about the 7 projects being $285 million, but you also talked about some institutions paying off debt or debt goes off. How much, and last year, or 2 years ago, you had a graph of what the bump up would be. How much gets paid off over this biennium? How much are we adding additionally to our
I
debt?
have it with me, but I can get it to you.
Okay.
We'll provide that chart.
Are we paying off, 200, or are we paying off 300, or whatever, that sort of
You
thing?
can look
would be
when we're
important.
seeing, there's a significant, if you look at by campus, and we'll try to get the aggregated number, but you're seeing a lot of debt come off. Now, some of those, obviously, the percent is not an indicator of the amount of money because it was a small project, so, at some of those schools. So, but we'll, if we can't get it to you today, we will get it to you, and we'll try to share a copy of that kind of
If you
stuff.
have it by ways and means
I
presentation.
think it is
that would be
important, when
fine.
you figure out what's coming off when you're putting more on at the same time. Those are both important questions.
Budget Director Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question about the state financial aid support line item on page 18 of the presentation. I just want to be clear that this line as expressed here shows a flat amount for the 21st Century Scholars Award.
That's correct.
And I believe the commission voted on a flat amount, is that right?
We did not vote on we voted for a flat amount for Franco Band and for Over. Basically with this, we said, our vote is irrelevant on this because it's an entitlement. So we didn't really cast a vote specifically on 21st century.
What number do you believe that needs to be? Are you saying that it should be a flat appropriation, or do you believe that it needs to
Well,
increase?
I think if you meet the terms of the unless there is a statutory change, and you meet what is current requirement by law, I think our best estimate is it's about $93 million over the 2 years.
How much?
$93 million over the 2 years.
An increase. Okay. Thanks.
There's the unstated assumption in this request that the state does have limits on its resources. So I'm assuming that this recommendation was not made in a vacuum, thinking that we need to ask for whatever we think we need for higher education, that the request is being made with the assumption that there are parameters about how much money is available. Is that correct?
Coming to you with the recommendations that the universities brought to us.
Okay.
And so we basically tried to balance all of those based on the fiscal realities, understanding that we'll know even more today and going forward, and that this is a fluid process. But we were ever mindful and had conversations with OMB and others throughout this process to try to be mindful of the competing interests of state government and the entitlement parts, and whether it's Medicaid or 21st century, that there are some of those that, short of a statutory change, you start with a base amount of money you have to spend.
And I also assume that early in the recommendation on your principles that you have there, you listed the commitment to quality. And so I assume that the commission members, at least implicitly, if not overtly, talked about how they're committed to producing the best system that we can, regardless of the amounts that we're able to fund. At least I hope that that's their attitude. Sometimes when you're not the person that has to decide, then you get you might say, a moral, not a moral, but a sort of a setback in your attitude if you don't get what you ask for, you know. And so I assume the commission is sophisticated enough that they know that they need to keep the quality goal there, regardless of what the amounts are that we're able to do in the final analysis.
Intentionally call out quality in our strategic plan, and it's
Okay.
why we also had productivity as a part of that as well, as
Sure.
to try to build a more productive system of higher education that can serve more students in an affordable way and still maintain academic quality. And you can't do one of those. You have to do
Right.
all of them at the same time.
Right. Well, are there more questions or thoughts? Well, we appreciate your thoughtful and thorough presentation. It'll be a big help to us on a tough job this year. Thank you.
Actually, I'm going to run and see a couple people out here. I didn't know you were going to do that.
Excuse me? Are you? Ready to get this done and be done? Yeah. Exactly.
Have a chance to hear about the revenue forecast.
No.
Which helps.
So this one, a little bit quicker.
Beautiful day for Medicaid and revenue. Did Paul talk with you about the session yesterday? They wanted another 30 minutes. They wanted a commitment right then. I'm just like. We found this on the island and stuff. Forward with. Yeah, you can't pull these things off the table.
Have a long line out your door.
Opposed to what? I'm already got that. On things I haven't even committed to yet.
Limited. Kind of highlighted. You want to highlight this time that over the last 2010 through 14 been at 3%. So. Ask about it. Why there's the 350.
I think it's nice that you've broken out where the increases are. Putting the plants on managed care, that's all. On this thing now. Do we really need a PBM?
Okay, are we ready to go here? Our next item on the agenda is to receive the Medicaid forecast. And we have the Secretary of FSSA with us, Dr. Werner is here. So, Dr. Werner, thank you for coming. And Rob, it's good to see you again. I know we'll get a good presentation. And so, Dr. Werner, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Senator and Mr. Chairman. Greetings to all the committee members and staff. Happy holidays. Thank you for this opportunity to present what we believe is a tight presentation concerning the Medicaid forecast going forward. I think all of you know Mr. Rob Damler from Millman, and he'll be leading the presentation, and then we hopefully will have time if there's any specific questions as we're going along. I've brought Mr. Gargano, Mr. Bowling with me from my staff. We'll be glad to answer any questions the committee has going
We're
forward.
glad to have Michael back with us, too. I know he'll be a big help to you, and
Sir.
great, great. Thank you, Michael. Now, you have your blue light on down there, Rob? Good.
So, thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. So, as highlighted here, this is our first forecast presentation for state fiscal years 2016 and 17. We are also highlighting the 2014, which is closed, and what we are projecting through 2015. As an important point of information, we are using data through September 30th, 2014. So we took data paid through and enrollment information through September 30th to present this information. So the Medicaid forecast has some new programs that are being projected within this forecast presentation. The first is Healthy Indiana Plan 2.0. We have illustrated the impact and changes associated with this program to be effective January 1st, 2015. And on a state and federal basis, all the values that are shown here, to the extent that January 1st, 2015, if there is any change in that, it would change the values that are shown here on a gross state and federal basis just due to the timing of that program. Under HIP 2.0, we'll have new covered populations. We will have a new adult group up to 138% of the federal poverty level. We will be receiving the enhanced match on this new adult group. The enhanced match is 100% for calendar years 15 and 16, and then after that it will drop to 95% beginning in calendar year 17. So on January 1st, 2017, which is halfway through our next fiscal year, we will have to pick up 5% of the cost of the new adult group. HIP 1.0 members that we have today, we have about 55 to 60,000 HIP 1.0 members. They'll be converted to HIP 2.0, and we receive the standard match, which is approximately 66% federal. We will convert them to receiving the full enhanced match as well. So the 66% that we're receiving today on HIP 1.0 enrollees, as they convert to HIP 2.0, we will receive the 100% federal match as the rest of the new adult group. Hoosier HealthWise adults, age 19 and over, will be also converted into the HIP 2.0 program. However, they'll stay at the regular match, the 66-34% match that we have today. So while they're enrolled in the program and have those benefits and program design changes, they will be receiving the regular match rate going forward. What is the fiscal impact associated with HIP 2.0? There is no impact to the Medicaid assistance appropriation. During state fiscal years 15 and 16, the costs will be funded through the Indiana Checkup Fund and related cigarette tax funding. And then in state fiscal year 2017 and later, it will be funded.
Excuse me.
Yes.
The checkup fund is what?
The checkup fund is the accumulation of the additional cigarette tax funds that were developed when HIP 1.0 was implemented.
So this was the reserve that was planned for previously to handle this specific type of a problem, and so that's what the checkup fund refers to.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. And on that status of that fund, do you have a presentation or a chart or anything that you could send us that shows us, if this assumption is made, how long that fund will last in this exercise?
We do not have in today's presentation any specific illustration of the Indiana Checkup Fund.
Okay.
However, we can follow up with you. We have done those projections.
Doctor, if you would work with Budget Director Bailey and kind of help make sure that we have that picture. Okay.
So We have done projections through 2020 for the Indiana Checkup Fund, and that fund balance will, there will still be a positive fund balance in state fiscal year 2020.
Thank you.
The cost associated with this program will be the state share for the new adult group, which I represented as 5% beginning in calendar year 2017. We will also have costs associated with a physician reimbursement increase for the Medicaid program. For those that are not in the Healthy Indiana Plan, the Healthy Indiana Plan members, their providers will be receiving payment at an equivalent amount to Medicare. So those providers for the members enrolled in Healthy Indiana Plan, both the new adult group and the Hoosier HealthWise adults that are converting over to HIP 2.0, their providers are reimbursed according to the Healthy Indiana Plan legislation at Medicare reimbursement. However, we are also increasing for the remaining fee-for-service and managed care enrollees to 75% of the physician fee schedule, which represents about a 25% increase in reimbursement across the board to all physicians. However, certain physician groups will receive a greater increase just because we are rebalancing the physician fee schedule as well.
And the reason why we're doing this is to try to have more medical services available to those patients in those categories.
Yes, we anticipate with HIP 2.0, we will be covering an additional 350,000 plus lives in our program, and this may create a demand for physician-related services. The Medicaid physician fee schedule in general had not been updated since 1995, so there had not been a change in the physician fee schedule in approximately 20 years. And so this is to provide an increase to those providers to have better access, maintain the access, given all the new members that will also be enrolling in the Medicaid program.
Thank you. Senator Italian.
Just a quick question on that. So until HIP 2 goes into place, are these physicians still getting the old Medicaid rates? And are we still doing a holdback on those payments?
I'm not certain of the holdback specifically on those payments, but to answer your first question with regard to the implementation of this fee schedule increase, it is planned to begin at the same time as HIP 2.0. So they are still receiving the current Medicaid fee schedule until HIP 2.0 is implemented.
But you don't know about whether we're holding back payments, holding back percentage?
Senator, are you specifically talking about fee-for-service payments, or because the managed care payments are not being held back? I'm not sure what you're talking about specifically.
All right, I'll let that pay. I'll find out the information I need.
Representative Gooden.
Thank you. Well, first of all, if you're going to get information, you're just going to get some information to Brian there. If I'm sure he'll get that to all of us. Okay.
And of course.
And I'm not trying to answer her question about just to maybe expand on that. I think I've had some physicians contact me about the lateness of their reimbursements, and that the state's holding back money. They may not. They'll file the reimbursement, and they're actually filing it electronically, and it'll be 90 days, 120 days before they're getting reimbursed. And it's supposed to be a 30-day to 45-day turnaround. So that just food for thought as we move forward. They're getting aggravated about that part, and the part is I'm going to quit doing this because they won't pay me
Just remember,
my money.
with a clean claim, we have 21 days to pay. If not, then we're paying interest on those.
Right. They say
payments,
that's not happening, so
They're
but we'll
not
talk
getting the
about
interest
that later.
payments? Okay.
There any additional questions on HIP 2.0? Okay, there are additional new programs that are also being proposed. The Hoosier Care Connect program is being projected to be effective April 1st, 2015. This is a managed care program for the aged, blind, disabled enrollees. It will exclude those who are also Medicare eligible. So we have two groups of while we have one group of aged, blind, disabled enrollees, some of them are also eligible for Medicare and some are Medicaid only. This will only include those who are Medicaid only. It will also exclude long-term care recipients, those who are currently receiving any institutionalized services or on a home and community-based waiver program. There will be a little bit of a projected fiscal impact during state fiscal year 15 and into a little bit into 2016 as well. We have, during the first year of the program, we do operate on a paid claim basis for our state fiscal years. So during the first year of the program, when the program's implemented on April 1st, we will be making our managed care capitation payments. And as just briefly referenced with regard to physician payments, we will have to continue to pay fee-for-service claims that are submitted for these members as well after April 1st, 2015. This may be physician claims, pharmacy claims, hospital claims, those incurred prior to April 1st, 2015 and submitted post-April 1st, 2015 will be paid as well. So there is a small impact associated with that in 2015 and a little bit into 16. However, we are projecting savings of 3% to 5% after implementation of this program for the healthcare costs associated with this population.
And that's due to the managed care approach itself, the way that is provided.
Yes, it is associated with the managed care program. Other managed care changes that we are experiencing during 2015, this is the first year that we'll be paying the health insurer fee to be paid during state fiscal year 2015. That is the health insurer fee assessed under the Affordable Care Act of all fully insured health insurance programs, such as our managed care program for the Medicaid members. There is a portion of that that is being charged a health insurer fee, and that is a fee that is paid to the federal government.
This is a fee, so tell me, try to educate me just a little bit. That's a fee that we pay as a state to the feds.
Yes, that we pay it, our payment
For
is
what?
actually to the.
Is this for a service rendered, or is it just a tax on the state?
It is a tax on the managed care plans,
Okay,
and under actuarial soundness requirements of the managed care rates that we pay to the health plans, we must support financially that tax.
the state.
The state does.
So the state, the Fed is levying a tax on the state.
It is levying a tax
On all
health
providers.
all health insurer carriers, which would include the state Medicaid
And how
programs.
big is that tax?
The total federal tax is $8 billion in 2014. It grows to $10 billion next year and will continue to grow to $14 billion and then grow with inflation after that.
Is it a flat fee, or is it a percentage of the cost of the program, or how is that thing calculated?
It is calculated in relation to all the premiums in the United States. So we
it's a
have to-
Percentage of the premiums.
So, for example, during 2015 fiscal year, our share of this amount, and I do have that here further into the presentation, but our share of the amount is approximately let's see, I think it was approximately $15 million during state fiscal year 2015 of state funds.
So that's actually an so if you wanted to, you could characterize that as an offset on the enhanced copay that the feds say that they're going to give us on these programs that through the Affordable Care Act. Isn't that right? I mean, that would be a way of thinking about that.
This health insurance
So that
fee,
when they say they're paying 100%, it's really 100% less your fee. And when they say it's 90, it's really 90 less your fee on your managed care programs.
Yes, the fee is associated with all your managed care programs, both the new programs for the expansion populations as well as the current programs.
Okay. Just clarifying that.
And I'll follow up with
You're going to have to
the,
change your rhetoric, Senator Italian, on what the deal is now.
and I'll follow up with regard to what the amount of the health insurer fee was during fiscal year 15 and what it's projected to be in future years, just to clarify that exact amount.
Thank you.
Also in the Hoosier Care Connect program in HIP 2.0, we will be carving into the managed care capitation rates pharmacy program and the dental services will be now covered under the managed care programs. Under the Hoosier HealthWise program, these two services are not covered under Hoosier HealthWise program. They're covered fee for service. However, with these two new programs, we are covering pharmacy and dental. Other changes, the hospital assessment fee, which was effective August 1st, 2014. There was a new rule of how we needed to calculate the hospital assessment fee, and we had to update our values. This resulted in a reduction of about 15 to 20% in gross hospital reimbursement due to a reduction in the hospital assessment fee to the hospital system. Again, we have some cost savings initiatives have been assumed to continue through state fiscal year 2017. They're currently scheduled to expire at the end of this fiscal year. These include those that are identified here, a 3% reduction to hospital services, home health and nursing home, and a 1% reduction to ICFID facilities, as well as maintaining the maximum pharmacy dispensing fee at $3.90. So these are projected to continue into the next 2 fiscal years, even though that would require follow-up following June 30th, 15. As a follow-up to one of the program and policy changes that occurred during state fiscal year 14, right at the end, was our 1634 transition. This impacted our aged, blinded, disabled populations and those spin-down enrollees. So we converted from being what's referred to as a 209B state to a 1634 state. So now what we will do is receive the disability determination from the federal government to identify those who are disabled and qualify under the Medicaid program. There have been some additional shifts from our non-disabled to disabled status because they are qualified under the federal program as disabled, and therefore we have auto-enrollment of those who are unenrolled SSI recipients. So people who had not previously presented themselves as SSI disabled are now auto-enrolled because we just received an eligibility file from the federal government on this, and they are enrolled. So there has been some enrollment changes associated with this program. Other changes associated with our forecast, the eligible but unenrolled, both healthy adults and children, we have not realized our actual estimates that we had projected for state fiscal year 14. We thought that there would be more enrollment beginning on January 1st, 2014 of those already eligible but unenrolled. We were short by, we had projected maybe 80,000 to 90,000, both children. Most of those were children, but also some adults. And we were short of that by about 50,000. Now we do anticipate potentially with HIP 2.0 and the, again, additional outreach and advertisement that there may be some of this enrollment coming forth. Indiana was one of the states that did not realize as much enrollment, where the states that did expand these individuals who are currently eligible but unenrolled, and states that were expanding definitely saw those individuals presenting themselves and becoming eligible under the traditional Medicaid program. So we still may experience it with the implementation of HIP 2.0. Under long-term care services, we do have projected demand growth from demographics. Again, the baby boomer generation is slowly aging into the nursing home eligible population, so we will be having more and more individuals presenting for either nursing home services or home and community-based waiver services as an alternative. and we are continuing to try to rebalance to create more community solutions and less institutionalized solutions. On slide 6 here, we are presenting the 2016 and 2017 forecast general fund assistance need, as well as we're illustrating the 14 and 15 values. The expenditures are projected to grow, as shown here, on a state and federal basis from 14 to 15. As well as into 2016. A lot of that growth will be due to the implementation of HIP 2.0. Now, we're showing the values on a state and federal basis, and some of that HIP 2.0 funding has been funded through the Indiana Checkup Trust Fund and the cigarette tax receipts associated with that. So we do have alternative funding. So while we do see a gross increase in 15 and 16 on a state and federal basis, the impact, there is no impact to the general fund assistance need shown below. So we are only requesting a 0.8% increase from 15 to 16 on our projected general fund assistance need. We are projecting for 15 to end at $1,995,000, and then just slightly over $2 billion, so $2,011 million. And then a 4.5% increase in growth into 2017 of $2.1 billion.
And the total program by 17 will be $11.7 billion.
Yes, that is correct.
So it really won't quite be as big as our entire state budget, but we just keep moving in that direction.
Yes. Again, that is on a state and federal basis. So. Any questions on that specifically?
Yes, Senator Talion.
Thank you. A couple things. I just want to congratulate you on the fact that we're no longer calling those eligible but unenrolled woodworkers. So I think we're moving forward. But I do have a question on these projected expenditures and funding, actually. You're saying that you're basing, help me understand this, you're saying you're basing these projections on HIP 2 being in place on January 1st?
Yes, that is correct.
That's like 2 weeks from now. So what are the ramifications of all these numbers if we don't get approval for, I mean, I'm just throwing out a number, if we don't get approval for 6 months? What happens to all these figures?
We would need to go through and reestimate the timing of the enrollment, because there are enrollment shifts that we have projected to occur. We are fully funding HIP 2.0 from cigarette tax and the Indiana Checkup Fund balance. So to the extent that individual lives stay within Medicaid assistance rather than, so for example, the Hoosier Healthwise adults, that population, there may be some timing differences, but we're projecting this to be January 1st. We do not expect significant impacts to these budget forecasts even with a delay in the program.
Oh, all right, you'll have to explain that to me, because I don't understand how you're doing that. I mean, you're expected to pick up, I think maybe I wrote the number down, 300 and some thousand additional people.
That is correct.
And those are built into these numbers, the numbers that are up there?
Yes.
Well, so this chart isn't, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong. I don't understand. This chart assumes that we're going to pick up 300 and some thousand people and time them over whatever, but that it starts January 1st and that's just not going to happen. So what do these numbers tell us?
So first of all, just from the illustration here, we do have in the upper half under the expenditures during state fiscal year 2016, you can see that we have an expense under HIP 2.0 right at $2.9 billion. It's labeled 2,897 on this chart. The federal government is paying for 100% of the expansion population. So therefore, when we are speaking about the general fund assistance need, there is no impact to the general fund assistance need because we're receiving 100% federal funding associated with that program.
So,
The top part of the chart is state and federal. The bottom part of the chart is the state portion of that.
so Senator Tallien, let me chime in with you here. So in that blocking there where it says HIP 1.0, since we're moving to the HIP 2.0, the $246 million estimate disappears, which would be a state expense,
Partial state expense, yes.
partial state expense. And so if we don't get on the HIP 2.0, will that partial amount come back into play? Is that a follow-on on what you're asking, Senator Tallien?
Since we're focused on the general fund assistance need, HIP 1.0, while we do pay our 34% share, is currently funded through the Indiana Checkup Fund in the cigarette tax. So
So we're paying for it out of reserves, so it doesn't have an operating fund impact.
that is correct.
Does that,
Yes, that's what I'm trying to find out is
Okay.
if HIP 2.0 doesn't go into effect on January 1st, which of these numbers do we need to look at that will either be saved money or that will cost us more money because we're not enrolled in HIP 2.0 yet?
So our general fund assistance need is not projected to change with the timing of HIP 2.0. However, the expenditures on a gross state and federal basis will change with the timing of HIP 2.0. So, for example, if HIP 2.0 is delayed to July 1st, as an example, under fiscal year 15, we have HIP 1.0 expense of $246 million. If HIP 1.0 would continue for another 6 months, we would probably spend another $246 million. So that one would go up. The value below that, the $1,320,000,000, would disappear. But on a bottom line, general fund Medicaid assistance, that number remains unchanged because both of those components are funded through other sources, either through federal funds. The HIP 2.0 would have been through federal funds. HIP 1.0 is from the cigarette tax and the Indiana Checkup Fund. So while it's changing the expenditures up above and how large our program is, it does not affect the general fund assistance need.
Representative Klinker?
Mr. Chairman, if this all goes through, and I hope it does, when do you assume the Medicaid dollars for doctors will go up? Would that be at the same time, Medicaid reimbursement?
Yes, the Medicaid reimbursement on an incurred basis would increase with the implementation of HIP 2.0. So again, we've assumed HIP 2.0 becoming effective January 1st, 2015.
Their reimbursement would change immediately?
The reimbursement would also change on January 1st, 2015.
For dates of service going forward.
Yes, for a claim, an office visit, surgical service performed on or after January 1st would increase as well.
Well, there are many of us that have had the experience that many doctors will see Medicaid patients and not even file because of the reimbursement, but also the time lapse that was mentioned, the time lapse when they're receiving their dollars. And do you think the encouragement of the raise and wages will encourage more doctors to take Medicaid in the state?
I can speak to that, absolutely.
Yes, please.
Absolutely, Representative. I've been around the state. I've obviously
I know
talked
you
to a lot
have.
of physicians, and they're solidly on board with this. They welcome the increase because we really don't believe that you're going to, just providing more coverage doesn't give access. So we really believe this is a solution to expanding access.
And are they willing to take Medicaid patients in some instances?
They're more than happy to take Medicare rates.
Medicare, okay.
If Medicare rates are attached to Medicaid patients, then the answer to your question is yes.
Okay. And then another question. In this state, and I've had some folks call me, many of our Hispanic folks are not able to get the WIC services, women and children. We're one of the few states where we do not accept folks. Many times they are illegal immigrants. But the WIC program has proven to be a very substantial program decreasing infant mortality. Do you see the state assuming someday to allow those people to enter into WIC services?
Actually, the nutritional programs available through community health centers, charity organizations, the federally
Regs
qualified health centers, food pantries is quite robust. And the charity programs like through Eskenazi and others do help with nutritional assistance for undocumented Hispanics who couldn't otherwise get assistance or state benefits.
It's just certain places that don't have access, then what you're saying. There are accessible points.
I'm sure in very rural areas there may be issues, but we'll certainly work
Yes.
to help expand that into those areas. But you're correct, they wouldn't be eligible for the standard federal WIC program.
Thank you.
We were hoping that you and Senator Talley would make the phone call that would make all of this work out. Representative Gooden.
Without trying to get too deep in the weeds here, because we could spend hours and hours here talking about this, but with the way you're presenting this, I understand the frustration with Senator Talley, and I sense it on the other folks' faces. They're not saying anything, but just an example, you're saying that the reimbursement rate's going to go up for physicians under 2.0, and you've used that in this calculation. But if we don't get accepted to 2.0, it'll still be at the lower rate. So there's going to be a percentage of savings there. I guess at some point, under the will of the chairman, is it possible that if we do see that we're going to be accepted into 2.0 and there's pretty stead confidence or it's going to happen, that we could have these folks come back and redo these numbers? I mean, honestly, no offense, I don't mean this, I'm not trying to be bashing here, but truthfully, this is what ifs and all that. I mean, I understand how you're pulling that backwards, and I know we're here, we got to do this, I know that, but can we ask Senator at some point when we do get that confirmation that they can come in and give us, I'm not going to call it real numbers, but more accurate numbers. I'm not saying anybody's trying to hide anything, but this is kind of just,
Well, they will be coming back in April for sure. And whether they come back before then or not probably depends on whether Representative Klinker and Senator Talley make the phone call. Well,
I was waiting for you to come up with this.
Well, I think that the presentation as it's being made, which appears to be making certain assumptions, which we know is not going to necessarily happen within 2 weeks, I think has value because through our questioning and through the way they presented it, we are seeing what the difference is in the alternatives, and we really do need to see that, and there might need to be some cleanup clarification once we get there, and I appreciate your request.
you've stated that better than I did. So, thank you very much, Mr.
Okay.
Chairman. And as we move forward and listen to the numbers, we got to keep that caveat in the back of our minds that this is
Absolutely
gonna
right.
change. All right, thank you, sir.
To continue on, the next slide. I'm not going to walk through this unless there are any questions that you had prepared prior to this. One of the issues that was identified in prior discussions with some of the fiscal analysts and state budget was the increase in expenditures between state fiscal year 2014, which is $1,632 million, to state fiscal year 2015, which is just under $2 billion at $1,995. Why is there an increase of $360 million? Some of this was with regard to payment timing issues, some things that were paid in 15 that we had anticipated paying in 14, so payment timing shifts. We have higher pharmacy spend with regard to Sovaldi and other high-cost pharmaceuticals. So there are reasons why I've outlined them here. I'm not going to go through them all. If you would like to understand them, I can address any questions. Otherwise, I'll just move forward.
Yes, Senator Talion.
Thank you. I'm trying to figure out about the surplus between, the difference between what was appropriated and what we spent. And so we show a surplus in 14 of 182 million, and that's already been moved over, correct, to the reserve fund or some part of that?
Yeah, Chairman, Budget Director Bailey.
50 million of that was moved over at the end of closeout, fiscal 14. And when we hand out the surplus statement that's going to take into account the revenue forecast, we'll show the remaining amount moved into the Medicaid reserve fund.
Okay, and so was there also like another 180 for 2013?
I don't recall the values on 2013.
The budget bill required that 250 million be moved from the general fund into the Medicaid reserve fund, and those funds were moved.
No, I remember that we moved the funds. What I'm asking about is the difference between what's projected, what's appropriated,
Yes.
based on the projections, and what's actually spent. And it just seems to me, and tell me if I'm wrong, that we've been off by $100, $200 million for several years. Is that right?
Senator, I'm going to use the metaphor that you don't like, but the woodwork effect became a toothpick effect. Okay, many fewer people that were projected to be accounting for that number. It didn't happen. The number of folks didn't come on the plan that we anticipated.
But that's just the last budget cycle, right? Where those numbers were put in there? I'm talking about over a number of years.
That is the last budget cycle that he's talking about, and that's what we're dealing with. And I don't know, going back further than that, your statement may be accurate. I'm not sure what bearing that has on where we are today, but I'm sure that Budget Director Bailey probably has access to the history that could help you get that information.
Let me just tell you my concern about this
Okay.
is that we do these projections, and then we make decisions based on those projections, and we make decisions about where to spend money in a whole range of different places. And then, when we end up with a couple $100, $300 million unused, it gets moved to Medicaid reserve, and then it sits there. And in the meantime, maybe we, had we changed our assumptions, we might have spent some of that money in other places. That's where I'm trying to go with this. And so I guess I'm just trying to figure out, how much money do we have in Medicaid reserve right now?
I can't address the reserve fund. I can address your comment with regard to 2014. There were some assumptions that were projected for state fiscal year 2014. So we presented the budget in April of 2013 for 14 and 15, and that's where the appropriation was established. I agree that some of our assumptions for 2014 were not realized. That, for example, if we had projected 3% enrollment growth, that enrollment growth was only 2% or 1%. So I do recognize that for state fiscal year 2014, we had a higher projection than what was realized. Some of that is also due to things that were one-time effects that happened in 2014. For example, the state received a $20 million amount back in some audit payments that occurred one time in state fiscal year 2014, which contributed to the $180 million surplus. We had not known about that. We were not aware that it was going to occur, and so therefore, when it does occur, it does hit to the surplus amount. So there were several issues that identified the surplus in 2000, both with regard to projection assumptions as well as payment timing cycles and one-time effects. We can follow up with you and help you. We have a listing of where were assumptions different and what generated the $180 million surplus for 14. We have that outlined, and we can provide that to you as follow-up to this discussion. One of the things that I would like to do is go to the next page to help you understand our projection and our projection cycle, because we have heard from not only from you, Senator Talian, today, but other fiscal analysts prior to this and budget, how can we make assumptions? What are our assumptions going forward? And so what we are presenting here is what our assumptions are for both enrollment growth as well as healthcare cost trends over the next biennium. These values are presented as annual values. We have also shown to you what the historical values are from if you compare state fiscal year 10 through state fiscal year 14. And so, for example, under low-income adults, we are forecasting a 1% growth rate in their enrollment, baseline enrollment, over the next 2 years, 1% each year. Over the past 4 years, our historical growth has been 1.1%. Children in CHIP, we are projecting a 1% growth rate. Historically, over the past 4 years, we have had a 1.9% growth rate. So we are assuming that it will be cut in half. So you can see both our forecasted numbers and historical. Disabled population, we're projecting 3% growth, although we've seen 6.7% annual growth in the disabled population. Again, what we're anticipating is that with the conversion, with some of the other changes that have happened in our disabled program in the last 4 years, that has created higher trend rates, and we're anticipating that those trend rates will slow down in the next 2 years. You can see that many of our assumptions that we have outlined here, the rest that are shown here are on healthcare costs, that we are forecasting values lower than what the 4-year historical value has been. For example, physician services, we have a trend of 1.5%. Historically, over the past 4 years, it has grown at 3%. So what we have tried to do is bring our assumptions closer to a true projection, what we believe, with as little margin in this projection for the next 2 years as feasible. So historically, we've had slightly higher trends than this. We've presented these forecasted trends to you previously. If you would go back to prior years, you may see a physician services trend of 2.5% or 3%. We are backing off that for the next budget cycle at 1.5%. So these are our key assumptions. You can compare some of these to historical values. Some of the historical values are greater, a few of them are less, but we are trying to provide the same information to you that we're reviewing as well. So to avoid the situation where the projections are different at the levels that we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years. But that does result in a potential that the appropriation may be short of the Medicaid expenditure over the next 2 years, given that we've tightened up our assumptions going forward in our forecast, given the 2 years forecasted that we're looking out.
I appreciate you including this page in here, Rob. I think that's very helpful to give us some comfort to look behind the scenes there on how you're making your forecasts. And it's no matter what you do, it's pretty difficult to do, but this does help get the picture out. Thank you.
With regard to enrollment, the next 2 pages just provide additional detail with regard to our enrollment projections. We have the Hoosier HealthWise program, we have Healthy Indiana Plan 1.0, and then we have Healthy Indiana Plan 2.0. There are some populations that are shifting from different line items throughout this illustration. For example, some of the adults will move from Hoosier HealthWise down into Healthy Indiana Plan 2.0. So there are some variations of individuals moving. You can see for the subtotals adults and children that we will grow from approximately 842,000 lives on average in state fiscal year 14 to, in 2017, 1.2 million lives enrolled in the Medicaid program
And
of just
actually-
adults and children.
And actually, that projection is consistent with the number that you projected 2 years ago for 2017, if I remember correctly.
That is correct. So for just the adults and children, this is a very comparable number to what we have been projecting. For the aged, blind, and disabled populations, we have many that are institutionalized in a nursing home or ICFID facilities. We have waiver, the state plan, home and community-based service programs, and then we have those who are not in either of those programs. We have dual eligibles. The Care Select program, those people will be moving to Hoosier Care Connect. We have other non-dual individuals, and then we have the Medicare Savings Program. So you can see our age of blind disabled population in 14 was just under 300 or just over 304,000 lives. That is projected to grow to close to 360,000 lives by 2017. So our total number of lives on Medicaid will grow from 1,147,000 on average in 14 to just under 1.6 million lives in the Medicaid program by 2017 on average.
So that means that almost 1 in 4 Hoosiers are going to be on Medicaid.
That is correct.
Okay, Chairman Brown.
Thank you. I saved my questions to the end. Is that okay?
Yes.
Who's still not getting rates paid that were back from 2008, 2009 levels? Who's still at lower levels from then? What provider groups?
Yes, that is illustrated on slide page 4.
And
The
you just say that the savings of 3 to 5% are still projected forward under rulemaking. Who are those?
Because it'd be hospital services, home health services and nursing home, and then the ICFID facilities. And I think the pharmacy dispensing fee at $3.90 would also be slightly lower than what it was. And I don't recall what the value was in 2008 and 2009. It may have been $4.40 if.
Okay.
So.
The House Bill 1391 had a study related to nursing home expenditures and kind of the growth of capacity. Is that report incorporated in this forecast?
I don't believe that I've seen that report specifically. We are continuing to project the number of lives, as well as the home and community-based program is growing for the elderly population as well.
Kind of paralleling what Senator Talion said, it seems to me that there's a lot of non-general money that goes into Medicaid, and so we really don't get a true picture of Medicaid total expenditure. I mean, where is Tobacco Master Settlement money for residential facilities and intermediate care facilities looked at in this total forecast?
So to the extent that those values are transferred through intergovernmental transfers, those are shown as an intergovernmental transfer. If they are covering, for example, any funds that are covered through CHIP, the CHIP program, while it's shown on a gross basis, is also netted out of this program. So CHIP is funded separately, and then any other intergovernmental transfers that may occur, whether it's hospital assessment fees that are used to offset some of those costs, or the tobacco master settlement funds, those would be shown through the intergovernmental transfer lines.
Okay. Will pregnancy, if your income's greater than 138%, will they no longer be paid for under Medicaid? Will they be told to go to the exchanges?
They will still be eligible for the Medicaid program moving forward after implementation of HIP 2.0.
But that would be an area where we could have a change in programmatic expenditures because they are eligible for exchange.
I'm not certain about the policy on that. I think under the Affordable Care Act, you have to maintain eligibility levels at, based on your eligibility level for pregnant women at December 9th, 1989, I believe. And so we'd have to go back to see what the eligibility level was on that date in the state of Indiana for pregnant women. If it's above the 138 level, which I believe it was, we would have to maintain that eligibility threshold.
Okay, thank you.
Any further questions or comments? Well, thank you, gentlemen, for your presentation, and we look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All the time. Like a little mini office in the hallway. Yeah, I've heard it was going to be communal space for reporters who are down here, say like for the end of session, but don't normally hang out.
I figured you would just confiscate it.
Oh, the WIBC now. No point in getting greedy. But now that you make the recommendation.
Your name.
I'll turn it to Abdul LLC. Put all my ventures under the umbrella. Like Tony Stark. Build a big giant oversized monument to my ego. Congratulations on your win in your caucus.
Thank you. I know, I'm going to walk up here at fourth floor. Well, it Tony comes in.
That's right.
Not even a little bit. Here's the thing, the economic although to be honest,
we've been having these budget hearings for 4 weeks now to virtually an empty room, and he doesn't understand why everybody's here all of a sudden. So, but this is the time and the hour that we do wait on, and so we're going to have our revenue forecast. First, we're going to hear from Doug Handler, who's going to give us an economic outlook from IHS, and you're their chief U.S. economist, I guess. And then David Reynolds is going to give the revenue forecast from the technical committee. So, Mr. Handler, thank you for being here. I think this is the first time that you've appeared before us. So we're glad to meet you and glad to hear from you. You might tell us a little bit about yourself or about your company so that we can get a feeling for where we are with this.
Okay. Thank you, Senator Kenley. It is indeed a pleasure to be here in front of you today. I am the chief U.S. economist at IHS. I'm responsible for both the U.S. macroeconomic and U.S. regional forecasting processes. IHS is a $2 billion information company, and within that we have a significant presence within the economic analysis and forecasting market here. Our processes are generally very statistical, very econometric in nature. My team is a very eclectic mix of academic econometricians and business economists, so we get the best of both worlds in our forecasts. My own personal background is actually more on the business economics side, so as chief economist, a large part of my job is actually to try and understand the academics, listen to them, and keep their opinions in check here while trying to make our forecasts as relevant as we can to our state and business customers.
Well, when we get this, I always think of that we're looking for an economist in the same way that Harry Truman was, and I know you know what I'm referring to, that he was looking for a one-armed economist because he didn't want somebody that just said on the one hand this and on the other hand that. So we look forward to hearing from you.
Desk organization interesting in our office. Thank you very much. Let me just get into the numbers and to start with the top line of where we are here as well. I often sit on panels representing the U.S. economy amidst a group of international economists, and invariably the opening remarks begin with that the U.S. economy is going to be the engine of global growth. And at these remarks, I always scratch my head thinking, oh no, this is not going to go well. And in fact, when I see forecasts of Russia and Japan against the U.S., I in fact do see where they're coming from here. And my point of view is, indeed, yes, the U.S. economy is actually doing very well compared with many other developing and developed countries, and will do better in 2015 additionally. But that still is not good enough really to hide my disappointment that the U.S. economy could in fact be doing better yet. We see 2.2% growth in real GDP this year, accelerating to 2.7% next year as well. The biggest headwind that we are looking at in our forecasting process is demographics. Normally, demographic variables are very slow-moving in nature, things that you have to take cognizance of, but not anything that you really care about on a quarter-to-quarter basis here. And that has actually proven to be a bit naive. The demographics has hit us in a slap in the face here with respect to the impact on our forecast, and is now a very significant part of our assumption base. And I'll have slides to demonstrate that going forward here as well. The good news, of course, is seen at the pump with the gasoline price dividends offered by consumers. This is something that has helped growth at the end of this year and will continue into the beginning of next year as well. And I'll have the forecast for gasoline and energy prices down a few slides. Our fiscal policy assumptions are really more of the same. I call it benign neglect, really, at least through the 2016 election. I'm not going to make a comment about the process by which we got to the numbers we got to, but the impact on the U.S. economy has been fairly positive here as well, and we see more of the same going forward here as well. Our assumption base also includes the Fed to take action in mid-2015 to raise interest rates. And again, we also see this as fairly much of a non-event here, in a way that the anticipation of the event probably would be worse than its actual impact. So just to get to some numbers here, real GDP growth in the third quarter was 3.9%. That's the second consecutive really good quarter following a really bad quarter in the first quarter, which was most definitely weather affected here. The second and third quarters were really characterized by a number of special features and a rebound from the poor weather in the first quarter as well. Now, our fourth quarter number is a bit slower than we've seen over the past 6 months here at about 2% growth here, but take this number with a grain of salt. All the other economic numbers will be better. GDP, as you know, is measured in somewhat non-intuitive way here, and some of the special effects that were started in the third quarter will be offset in the fourth quarter, and I think the economy will be better than the GDP numbers will indicate in January. Going forward, however, in 2015, it'll be a little bit different story. We'll start to see the headwinds from the rising dollar, which is also, besides demographics, one of the big things that we're concerned about as well here. With the rising dollar, of course, export growth slows as export prices become less competitive in global markets, and the potential for import substitution, that is, we buy goods abroad where instead of buying those domestically, also has the potential to slow the economy just a bit. However, the big question that business planners, governments are asking is, where's the growth? What has happened to the economy since the end of the recession? In the decade prior to the recession, average real GDP growth was about 3.2%, and since then it has downshifted to about 2.2%. The big question is, why did it downshift? And once we figure out those reasons, can we figure out if those reasons are sustainable or something that will reverse itself here? And for the most part, again, this is the one-armed thing here. The answer is a little of both, I'm afraid. The biggest aspect of the reduced growth is actually something that has been coming to an end, and that's the federal budget deficit reduction. The budget deficit was approximately 10% of GDP at the height of the recession. This was due primarily to the stimulus. It was large. The policymakers had to act fast, and to some extent this was successful at reducing the severity of the recession. But in the years since that stimulus was put in, we have been trying to progressively get that deficit down to something that's sustainable. And in the most recent data, in the fiscal 2014 data, that's down to 2.8% of GDP. That's nearly 7 percentage points of GDP that's not available for growth, but had gone to serve to reduce the federal budget deficit. Absolutely something that needed to be done, without a doubt, but one of the factors of slowing growth. Good news going forward is, at 2.8% of GDP, that's probably as low as it's going to go here. We don't see additional deficit reductions in the cards here. So like not hitting your head against the wall is good healthcare policy. The absence of more reductions in GDP is actually going to be helping the economy as well. Certainly there are other drivers of this lower growth as well. There's been a bit of retrenchment in consumer spending from higher taxes, debt retrenchment. Wage growth, of course, has been anemic. These are things that are probably not going to resolve itself in the near future. And business spending also has issues as well, in that the rebound in business investment isn't what it should be following such a severe downturn here as well. And a lot of reasons for that related to business risk. And for the most part, these also, I don't think, will resolve themselves. So more numbers. For those in the room here, if you've took
I wonder if I could ask a question at this point, if you don't mind. So we've reduced the deficit, and that's contributed to the fact that we haven't grown as much as we want. And I understand all the debates and the Keynesian theory and everything else. So as we get in this situation, if interest rates do rise and rise significantly, that we may owe on our debt, will that repayment of debt, that interest, will that cause will that continue to push down on our ability to have economic growth because we have that debt? Or do we just print more dollars and produce inflation, which we haven't been dealing with here recently? Can you help me with that?
It's a great question. The 2.8% number is very significant, that it's less than the growth of nominal GDP. Therefore, the debt to GDP ratio, which is essentially the relative debt here, actually will be going down a bit going forward. So we're in a nice steady state. The risk factor that you mentioned, though, of course, is very valid. What happens to interest rates? And we do have a rise in interest rates beginning in the second half of next year, without a doubt. But you really have two relatively offsetting factors, and our forecast for that debt to GDP ratio, even taking cognizance of the rise in interest rates, is fairly flat. So we're in a good...
Watch both sides of that.
Right. Essentially, the dynamics that we're seeing as of right now really will be fairly persistent going forward. If the debt increases more, of course, or interest rates increase faster than we thought about, it could be another story, but our forecast shows not a problem at this point.
All right. Sorry for the interruption.
For those of you who took macroeconomic theory in college, we actually use some of the concepts that are here. You'll recall the equations for GDP growth itself, that it has several components. The way you read this graph is that GDP growth is the blue bars on the left of each year, and the contributions to the GDP growth are the bars to the right of that blue bar. So we look at 2014 and the 2.2 growth in blue. Every other bar, or the sum of the bars to the right of that 2.2% total, the 2.2. Couple things stand out on this chart. One, of course, is the importance of consumer spending in our forecast going forward. It's about 2/3 of the economy, and goodness exists here that is contributing about 2/3 of the growth, if not more as well. And in fact, with the lower gas prices helping consumer demand, the economy's dependence on the consumer actually will be increasing in the coming months here. The other bar that I think sticks out on this is the red bar in imports. And to me, this is one of the big risk factors in the economy. As I mentioned, with the higher dollar, the potential for import substitution is high. And of course, increasing imports are a subtraction to GDP. And by 2016, actually, those imports will be growing, and our forecast includes a subtraction of about 1 percentage point of GDP. So the 2016 number, if imports stayed flat, would be 3.5 instead of 2.5. Of course, that's not going to happen, but you can see the importance of that sector, and that is actually one of the things we keep a very careful eye on. So let me talk about good news first, now that I've mentioned all the fears that we have, and that's, of course, with employment here. The labor market added 321,000 jobs in November and 2.7 million jobs over the past 12 months, and the unemployment rate has relentlessly declined to 5.8%. So what's the problem here? This is absolutely the type of graph you love to see. And there's actually a couple of them, really. The biggest one is the growth in the labor force has downshifted to first year. Normally, during a recession, of course, labor force growth is fairly weak, and you can see the recession bars in gray here, but labor force growth didn't recover. And we have to ask ourselves, how much of this labor force weakness is cyclical, that is fixable with more economic growth, or structural, meaning it's due to some other external factor that's not going to be fixed anytime soon here. And the answer to this question determines what the Federal Reserve Board will do and when. A slack labor market means that wage inflation isn't likely to occur anytime soon, and there's lots of room for economic growth. On the other hand, if the labor market is tight, that is, there are structural reasons that are not going to allow people to come into the labor market here. The labor market may be tighter than we think. Wage inflation could be around the corner, occur much sooner than we think as well, and we've got a problem. And you can see that the weakness in the labor force growth has driven the labor force participation rate down by 3 percentage points since the end of the recession. This is quite the big deal here. So again, Harry Truman would not be happy with me here that I do have to present the two-armed view. But the first arm here is one of the reasons for the slowing labor force growth is we're aging. Something absolutely structural in its cause. We cannot stop the aging process, unfortunately. Our econometric experts have forecasted that we're aging at a rate of 1 year per year on an econometric basis. Absolutely, absolutely. And it's a big deal. Pretty much as we age, the propensity to participate in the labor force goes down. Very easy. The retirements, taking care of kids, celebrating sending kids through college. Labor force participation rate among people in the middle age is near 80%. It goes down in the 55 to 59 cohort and keeps going down as you're getting older. Additionally, you can see on this graph the size of the labor force itself within each of these age brackets. It's growing hugely. So as we shift and get older, the odds are that a person will be working is going down. And quite simply, that's one of the main drivers of that lower labor force participation rate. That's structural. Unfortunately, that's not something we can do anything about, obviously. Here's the other issue here, the other arm here. So not only are we getting older, but we're not learning new tricks either here. That some of the labor force issues are clearly due to discouragement, and I think the discouragement is due to a discrepancy between where the jobs were lost during the recession and where the job growth has been since the end of the recession. During the recession, we lost 7.4 million jobs. Manufacturing jobs were down 2 million, construction jobs down 1.5 million, and you can see the red bars by sector and where the job losses were. Since the end of the recession, job growth is up by about 9 million and change here. We've actually more than made up the employment losses here, but the pattern of the job gains are much different than where the job losses were. That is, if you're going to be employed and you were working in manufacturing and construction, you got to figure out a plan B here as well. The job growth is in business services, it's in retail, it's in healthcare, and I will tell you this is not in brain surgeons, it's more of the home healthcare and the lower wage kinds of areas, and it's in leisure services as well here. So the pattern of job creation after the recession, absolutely very different than before. And why does this matter? Well, the job growth that we've seen is also in the low-wage occupations as well. Construction jobs, manufacturing jobs, paid very well. Leisure, hospitality jobs, retail, that's the trade, transportation, utilities, not so much. And if you're a manufacturer or manufacturing employee and you're earning $50,000 a year, you can really easily see that it's a reluctance of that person to take a job earning maybe $25,000 or $30,000 a year in the leisure hospitality area. The transition is get down to a person-by-person basis is just not all that smooth or comfortable. Certainly higher wages and better economic growth will help fix the situation, and to some extent, because of that, we do think there is some cyclical issues on the labor force growth that will be resolved, but just the same, it's a big assumption that that's going to happen. So, speaking of wages, let's take a look at the wage really impact on overall inflation here. The big story these days, of course, is lower energy prices. And you could see growth in something called the personal consumption price deflator. And it's more of a broader type of consumer price index that we economists use. But you can see for all goods and services, we're looking at a nice dip to about 0.3% in 2015 as well, mostly because of the lower energy prices. Now, the Fed, in its monetary policy process, uses something called core inflation, which is inflation excluding the food and energy sectors. But the forecast for that is pretty much flat as a pancake, only because it's been flat as a pancake now for many, many months here as well. So,
you know, I don't understand that. Do they not eat or drive that serve on the Fed board?
it's just the price index that takes out the impact of higher food and.
I know, but I don't even know why they bother, because we all eat and drive.
We all eat and drive, but the principle is that food and gasoline prices or oil prices more generally are really not affected so much by domestic business cycle considerations.
Okay.
And is concerned about how tight the market is, what the inflation impact is, not so much on what hog prices were 3 years ago and impacts of OPEC. We need to try and get a purer view of that. So, bottom line, as I mentioned previously, is in fact we do see the Fed acting around June of 2015, raising interest rates. There's, of course, two parameters to identifying when monetary policy changes will occur. One, of course, is how much, but the other is when as well. The when is midsummer. We think interest rates will be starting to rise next year, but really not by a lot here. This will be more the Fed just flexing its muscles, trying to demonstrate that it is on the job here with its inflation vigilance role here. Moreover, there is an overarching need for the Fed to return to what they're calling monetary policy normalization. With the near zero policy interest rates we have now, the Fed is relying on these quantitative easing programs, these bond purchases here as well. With interest rates above zero, they can start exercising their role in much more traditional ways here as well. By mid-year next year, the economy will be doing well, certainly can withstand the higher interest rates with really not a significant adverse impact. And the Fed, by being in a more comfortable spot, will be more able to execute monetary policy going forward in ways that people understand, recognize, and believe work. A couple slides about energy, if I may. This is more good news. The energy savings, the pump savings, is fantastic for the economy, as well as consumers, of course, spend less at the pump. They can spend that money elsewhere. They can also save it. They can also use it to pare down debt, but all of that is good. If we look at per household spending at an annual rate, and I caution you, this is an annual rate, this means energy prices have to fall and stay where they are for the year for this numbers to be occurring in actuality. It's not quite the case, but it's an annual rate of nearly $1,000 per household savings at the pump. So roughly about $20 a week per household with the lower energy prices as well. Big impact here, will very much help cement the fact that the Christmas season will be good, and the impact, there's still more to come on the energy prices and the pump savings as well through at least the first quarter and probably the second quarter of this year as well. There are flip sides, though, to the economy. There's a couple negatives with respect to energy's impact on the economy. One, of course, is on investment in mining and petroleum structures, drilling equipment. With lower prices, the incentives to drill will be less. This has been a very significant contributor to economic growth over the past several years here. We see a little bit of a downturn in the sector in the next 2 or 3 years. Relative to history, it's actually not that much of a downturn, but relative to what those numbers could have been if energy prices still had been $110, $120 a barrel, you know, it's a significant impact. The other area where energy impacts the economy is with imports. With domestic production, of course, we import less, and again, that subtraction of imports, of less import growth, is actually a very positive feature of the economy here. And you saw a few slides ago that I had big red bars here for declining import growth. The fact that imports of petroleum products will stabilize is one of those drivers of the red bar here. So let me talk a little bit about what's going on by region and in Indiana. We look at the regional outlook here. Pretty much the trends that we have seen over the past couple years we think are going to continue for the next couple years. It's not a rocket science forecast, but it's one that we do believe very strongly. States in the West and the Sun Belt will be among the fastest growing regions, very much led by housing growth, a recovery from a disproportionate housing bust, population growth, and employment gains as well. Manufacturing gains will be prevalent in the Midwest area, and you'll have a couple slides on that as well. And you'll start to see the impact of oil development in the energy producing areas, including North Dakota and Texas as well. So let's look at regional job growth by major census region here. Indiana, of course, is in the east-north central region, that big light blue bar, unfortunately, towards the southwest corner here. The two axes are employment growth year over year, that's the horizontal axis, and then employment growth over the last 3 months. And you can get from this graph whether or not employment growth has been strong or weak and is decelerating or accelerating here. Growth in the west-south central states that include Texas, Oklahoma, and the like has been expanding at the fastest rate in the country, and it includes most recently as well. With respect to Indiana, year over year, the employment growth has been about 0.9%, and over the last 3 months, so 1.1% as well. It's good growth to be sure, but certainly the east, north, central states are part of this little three-circle segment here in the southeast, which is not one of the better areas to be. But if we do look at that east, north central area in more detail, Indiana stands out very nicely compared with the other states in the region. There's been 1.7% growth year over year in employment and 1.3% growth over the last 3 months. So Indiana, by being closer to the northeast part of the graph here as well, is in a much better spot than the other states. And quite honestly, given the volatility, in the data, 1.7% versus 1.3% is really not anything to worry about whatsoever here. And if we look at job growth, of course, in the U.S., you can see how Indiana stands out. It's better than its Midwest peers, but still clearly not as good as the areas in the West and in the energy-producing areas, including Texas and North Dakota. North Dakota has the fastest economic growth in this graph at about 4%, and ironically, the slowest growing state is Alaska, with a decline of that 0.3% of a growth that you see there. So for 2015, you can see the color distribution is really not all that different than what we had in 2014 as well. Indiana, again, holds steady at 1.7%, and that contrasts with the overall U.S. growth of 1.9%. So most definitely, Indiana is growing at about the U.S. mean as well. Next year, the state with the fastest growth we expect to be Utah at 3%, and Alaska, again, still is going to trail the pack at 0.7%. Now, an interesting situation, of course, is looking at the years in when most states will have recovered the lost jobs here. To some extent, fast employment growth in many of the states is a function of the size of the employment losses during the recession. They went down further and faster and are coming back essentially further and faster as well. So we want to look at the return to peak dates as well. And with Indiana, actually this was this year, and our crack forecasting team has estimated that that person who added the incremental employment growth this year in Indiana was a automotive line worker in Fort Wayne. It's either that or the guy who we got coffee from here as well. So you can pretty much see the growth that we do have in Indiana. The recovery from the recession in 2009 has been very solid, but very very steady as well. It's not a bust, a boom, and a leveling off. It's a bust and a very solid, dynamic return to normalcy. And that sort of forecast, that sort of characterization describes our forecast through 2015. Thereafter, 2016, 17, for the most part, we see declining employment growth in the U.S. as the U.S. economy gets closer and closer to full employment as well, mostly a result of the Fed policy, mostly a result of simply an economy that is growing from a near capacity type of perspective here as well. But the levels, again, look good for the most part. And again, none of these changes really could be construed as all that alarming or overtly negative here. Housing starts and car registrations, some improvements in growth here. Car registrations are looking better and better, mostly as a function of improved unit sales in the U.S. Quite frankly, a nagging problem in the macroeconomy is why car sales hadn't been growing faster sooner, and we're starting to see that sort of data, and that sort of situation is reflected in our car registrations. The same situation with housing starts as well, that our forecast, we've been deferring this for years and years and years now, but we do expect a rebound in housing starts and housing sales going forward as income and employment levels start to give people enough confidence to make that sort of investment to buy a house. Wage gains, again, Indiana, growth will approximately be at about the level of the U.S., and you can see the relationship between the wage growth in Indiana and the U.S. has been remarkably consistent over the past few years. And as a forecaster, be hard pressed to bet against that trend changing going forward. And there's new data available from the BEA on personal consumption expenditures, that is, consumer expenditures on durable, non-durable goods and services by state. These data just came out relatively recently, and we're able to look at that and forecast it. We're not quite yet sure of the implications of these data here as well, but just the same as some fascinating data here. I feel compelled to show it, and you can see, again, the decline in expenditures in the non-durable goods in 2015. Again, that's gasoline and the impact here. Prices are most certainly included in these data, but overall, if we look at the levels of the personal consumption expenditures, it's most definitely a services world, and this sort of graph would look identical if it were to cover the U.S. here with respect to shares of durable, non-durable, and services. So to summarize what's going on in Indiana, got a list of variables here, and these are for the most part the key drivers that the state uses in the revenue forecast as well. Employment growth in 2014 will be 1.8%. We see it at 1.7% in 2015. That is driven again by the national totals, a slower increase in employment rather than anything that would be Indiana specific. The same thing can be said for employment growth in 2013 as well. The 250,000 job per month national gains are really not going to be continuing into 2016 that much. There'll be the slowdown, and that slowdown will affect every state for the most part here as well. As I mentioned, housing starts will continue to gain, retail sales looking better, and gross state product growing for the most part the same in 2015 and 2016 as had been the case last year and this year as well.
Mr. Handler, that total employment moving back down fairly significantly, is there, in general terms, it's been 59 or 60 months since we've had any downturn. Now, is that is that number, total employment, a reflection of that situation, or is there something else that's just telling you it's got to slow down?
This is a reflection of the fact that eventually I think we're going to be running out of workers in the labor force, at least in 2 years, and there really won't be that much growth in the labor force from the cyclical aspects of it by then. We'll be at full employment for the most part, and this really does reflect.
So the demographic of the older population is playing into this as well? Yes. Okay.
Yes. And this manifests itself in the gross state product forecast. Okay. The differences between 2013 and the other years here is, again, fairly insignificant. So this is really very much of what you see is what you're going to get forecast here.
And your previous slide, is that also, just as a side note, is that a reflection when you look at the economy being dominated by the services industry? That suggests that as you construct tax policy that you have to consider whether a sales tax really is becoming sort of a one-off exercise when it's limited to durable goods.
That would be my working assumption, yes.
Right.
I do like to end on some good news here, and do have a dissection of the employment growth by major industry as well. And as with the U.S. economy, the strongest areas of growth will be in professional and business services. That's something that's been around for several years and will continue as well here. The other source of good news in the graph in the second line here with the manufacturing growth, that it is really quite strong here, again, compared with the U.S. norms, and put a bar graph up here to compare Indiana with the U.S. And the one thing that I do want to call out is that the manufacturing growth in Indiana will be much better relative to the rest of the country, and most of that can be traceable to the motor vehicle equipment, the auto and truck manufacturing areas as well. A brief comment about our forecast track record. I'm actually quite proud of this as well, that if we look at how we've done with U.S. GDP and employment and the like, it's quite good. As I mentioned, the U.S. GDP for 2014 will be about 2.2%, and as much as 2 years ago, we were pretty much honed in on that number. The other thing, just in the interest of honesty, that I'll show you is the Indiana income number. In 2012 and even 2013, we were not as honed in on that number. We think that'll be about 2.2% also this year as well. And this is just a brief reminder that the data frequently get revised, and that was the driver of our change in the forecast between 2013 and 2014 here as well. So we do the best we can, but to some extent, the things that we're trying to forecast are moving targets. Anyway, the bottom line for Indiana is growth continues to be higher than its neighbors. Better to be in Indiana than a lot of other states in the region, but just the same, if you're looking to benefit from growth, other regions will be having a comparative advantage in the next year or two as well. The resurgent auto sector and manufacturing will be the key driver of that differential of growth here. Near-term growth will be favorable, but in the long term, the lack of population growth, the lack of labor force growth is one of the negative features keeping our forecast less effusive than it might be. So with that, I thank you for your time this morning.
Questions or comments? Chairman Brown.
Thank you. And maybe I'll take Senator Hirschman's spot, because you always used to ask Mr. Diffler, about how you did on the forecasting and your trending, and I'm glad you included that slide. But I did look at, I brought mine from 2 years ago from Mr. Diffler to your forecast today, and comparing on page 6 of your presentation, where you have GDP growth, consumer spending growth, and fixed investment growth across the whole country, your projections 2 years ago really fell short in business fixed investment. Any particular reason why?
Several, I'm afraid. One of the big reasons is housing sector. The dynamics that drive home purchases are quite favorable with respect to income growth, with respect to prices, with respect to essentially the value offering of housing, but the housing is also included in some of the investment to the extent that we have commercial and office buildings and the like, and that's been very disappointing as well. Another factor in the past year has actually been a tech bust here. You would think that in a fast-growing economy, companies would have higher propensities to invest in technology to update their existing systems and to benefit from a greater productivity growth. And that's been another disappointment as well. And the third factor is the drilling equipment as well. So, yeah, there have been a lot of issues that have risen over the last 12 months, I'm afraid, which distorted the forecast a year ago.
Okay, thank you. Under professional business service, could you maybe hone down a little bit more what business services mean? Or I guess my question might be, I've been involved in some local economic discussions, And temporary workers are sometimes classified under these business workers. Are temporary workers in business services?
Yes, they are.
So is that why that looks so big, is because of temporary workers?
It's one of the contributors. That also includes all the professional occupations that you might expect, doctors, lawyers, engineers. It also includes their support staffs as well, administrators, just general managers, and the like are also included. But your premise is correct that the temp workers, for the most part, are also in there.
You didn't make any statement or comment. You've talked about federal funds rate, and we had changing from substantially long period of time to a patience in the Ms. Yellen's comments yesterday. But what about corporate tax rates at the federal level and reducing them or trying to repatriatize, earnings from overseas to the United States? What impact will that have?
Well, let me start with our forecast. So we actually do not assume that will occur, and this gets to some of the tension that we have in our forecasting process, that sometimes we make assumptions that counter just common logic and common sense here as well. But with respect to the the two things actually you mentioned, certainly the lower tax rate with the base broadening and participating in more of a harmonization of international taxation rules and accounting, that would be a very good thing. It helps firms' investment decisions and locational decisions, make them more efficient, provides a greater revenue stream and the like here. Now, with respect to the repatriation of overseas cash, that's a challenging one. We tried that in 2004, actually, and I think that resulted in several $100 billion actually coming from overseas into the U.S. as well. The literature pretty much argues that most of that money, or I don't know about most, but a substantial part about the money was used for stock buybacks, dividend payments, or just to be held domestically as well. The job creation from those hundreds of billions of dollars really, I think, was disappointing. Again, it's my interpretation of the literature. So the question of whether or not new tax laws will allowing a repatriation will occur, I can't say. Much would depend on whether or not those tax laws are considered permanent or just as a one-time tax holiday. Really, the devil is in the details, but the experience has not been as good as one would like it to be.
The healthcare industry has been growing quite a bit in the last few years, and it's taking a larger share of our spending on a percentage basis. And you don't, on an apparent basis, seem to pull that factor out anywhere in this presentation. Do you think that situation is more a flattening out situation now, not as big of an impact on the rest of the economy, or have you buried it in here some other way? B. All right. Okay.
No. Yeah, if we did get into the structural changes in the healthcare industry, I think I would probably be here all day here, and I'm probably not the best person to talk about it. But from a macroeconomic perspective, what we're interested in is just very simply two things: the total cost of the program and where those costs are being spent.
Yeah.
The best data that we've seen so far is, in fact, all the changes in the healthcare system with the Affordable Care Act. It's a large displacement of revenue, to be sure, but it is a fairly neutral displacement of revenue. We've chosen as an economy to say we're going to be spending more on healthcare, and we're going to be taxing ourselves more as a result. That, from a macroeconomic standpoint, is a fairly neutral decision. I can talk about maybe the productivity gains you can get from having a healthier workforce, having your employment decisions be separate from your healthcare insurance decisions and the like. But to get into the micro aspects of this, I'm probably not the best person to talk about it.
Okay, all right, thank you. Yes, Representative Gooden has a question.
Mr. Chairman, I'll thank you for being here. It's very informative. No one, and you may not be able to answer this wholeheartedly, but what is the volatility of the oil market, knowing that the all oil is traded on as the dollar is the standard, and as the dollar continues to increase, of course, that's going to mean cheaper fuel for us. What impact will that have on our increase in production here, which you pointed that out some, but how volatile is that? I know it's difficult to project. I know we're just one car bomb away from $4 gallon gas again, but realistically, how much did you put into that? How much weight does that carry in your projections?
The impact is important at the margins, to be sure. I don't think I mentioned explicitly what our forecast is, that we forecast Brent oil prices, which are around $60 a barrel. Now we see that as being the rate for about the next 6 months. And for the next 4 or 5 years after that, we see the gradual return to where we were at the beginning of the year at $100 to $110 a barrel. So very much of a lopsided V-shaped kind of forecast here. On net, where we are, the decline in oil prices, if they persist and if that forecast comes true, will add about 4 or 5/10 of a percentage point to GDP. It's one of the drivers why 2015 is better than 2014. To get to your question finally, could it turn on a dime? Absolutely. We don't think so, though, given the disorganization of OPEC, given the length of time it takes to make production decisions from the lower prices and the like here as well. But when you're talking about commodity markets, I'm glad I'm not a trader.
I agree, and the reason I ask that is because we know that the majority of our growth is in the sector of consumer goods, people buying things, and if they have less money in their pocket because they've got to put it in the gas tank, then of course that skews those numbers tremendously. So that's why I asked that as we move forward. So thank you very much.
Any other questions or comments? Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Handler, for coming. We hope everything you said is true. Next, we're going to move right on to our revenue forecast, and David Reynolds, the senior fiscal analyst for the Senate, is going to present that with Eric, is it Busses? Busses, okay, who's the assistant director of the Tax and Revenue Division of BSA. What is BSA? SBA, State Budget Agency. That makes more sense. All right. While David's getting that up, it looks like he's about ready. I know that you'll do this, David, but you might mention who all worked to help prepare our revenue forecast, and it is a joint effort by a lot of people that we greatly appreciate their efforts, and so with that, I'll let you proceed.
Mr. Chairman, as you mentioned, I am joined here today by Eric Busses of the State Budget Agency, the Assistant Director. He is the replacement for Bob Lane. You probably remember that usually it was Bob Lane who sat here with us, so we're happy to have Eric join our team. As you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, the Revenue Technical Forecast Committee is a extension of the State Budget Committee, and it's made up of the members there in that large box in the middle there. Eric serves, the 4 fiscal analysts for each of the caucuses serves, and then we have Dr. John Mikesell from Indiana University Bloomington, and then we have 2 advisors, John Grew and Bill Sheldrick. We also get great assistance from the Legislative Services Agency and the Budget Agency. The process that we go through here is, you just heard from IHS Global Insights that provided the economic variables that are used in the formula. The role of the Revenue Technical Committee is to select the equations that we use, that we insert those variables in. It's a consensus process. We talked about this the other day. We believe this process has been going on for either 39 or 40 years. So this has been a process that served the state very, very well over those years. And I would mention that one of those members, Dr. John Meixel, has actually served on that committee since the very beginning. So
Well,
it's been a great service of Dr. Meixel.
We really need to stop and thank Dr. Meixel for his services to us, and that is a huge contribution, which is perhaps little known, but I know that he's been a brilliant professor for many years, and we thank Dr. Meixel for his work.
I know I'm standing between you and lunch, so I'm going to go fairly quickly over these equations and get to the bottom line, I'm sure, is what everybody wants to see. But quickly, as we look at where we are through November, sales tax, we are 1.4% above the December 13th forecast, 5.9% above the same period in fiscal year 14. On income taxes, we're 4.8% below the December 13 forecast and 9.3% above the same period in fiscal year 14. I would mention that 9.3, why it sounds pretty strong, if you adjust for the number of Fridays that occur in that period of time, one of the things we found, and I'll talk a little bit more about it when we get into the model, is the number of Fridays in a quarter makes a difference on what goes on with your individual income tax, your collections and your withholdings. And so when you adjust for that, because the current year had one extra Friday relative to the prior fiscal year, the growth is 6.3%. Corporate tax, we were 3.2 above the December 13 forecast and 8% below the same period last year. And on the gaming taxes, 16.3% below the forecast and 16.1 below the same period last year. As you just heard from Mr. Handler, the economic forecast, it was revised downward somewhat, but then continues the stable, slow growth that we've seen historically. As we looked at the different equations that we've used in the past, the corporate gaming, cigarette, and alcohol tax models, we stayed with the same model equations as we had in the past. We did change the sales and income. I would also mention that the forecast incorporates all of the rate reductions that have recently been passed. As the committee looked at individual income, we are thinking about this now in kind of three chunks, if you will. Individual income tax is made up with withholding, estimated payments, and what we call the reconciliation payments. The reconciliation payments are those payments that are made in generally at the end of the year when you file your tax returns. And so graphically, you can see here how withholding payments are, kind of just very steady, slowly growing over time, but yet estimated payments and these reconciliation payments fluctuate over time. Has to do with what's going on with the business cycle quite a bit. So the committee last time, the equation we used on the income tax, we had two equations. We separated out and tried to estimate estimated tax payments and then withholdings and reconciliation payments. This year we decided to try three equations. And so we are estimating the estimated payments and then a separate equation for withholdings and a second equation for reconciliations. So as we look at estimated payments, the variable that we're using in the equation is proprietor's income. And graphically, you can see here, this graph represents how the proprietor's income is the movement in propriety income and how it relates to the movement in what we see in estimated payments. Proprietor's income is a sector of the income, if you will. It's the current production income of proprietors, partners, and sub-corporations. Did I get that right? As we looked at withholdings, we're focusing in our equations on wages and salaries and the gross state product. Here graphically shows the relationship between those variables and what's going on with our withholdings. In the sales tax model, in the December 13 forecast, we were using personal income net of transfer payments and the labor force participation rate. This year, we're keeping the personal income net of transfer payments, and we're replacing the labor force with excuse me, the percent of adult population employed. Graphically, you see here that historically the pre-recession, between the blue line and the green line, the blue line is the personal income net of transfers, and the green line is the sales tax base. And you can see historically those lines stayed together. But during the recession, those lines started to separate. And so we're adding the percent of adult population to try to account for that separation. Riverboat and Racino taxes, competition continues to be, I'm good, I have some things. Competition continues to be the driving force on Riverboat and Racino taxes. And, you know, we continue to see the pressures from Illinois, Ohio, and the South Michigan tribal casinos. As you look at the Indiana gross gaming revenue, which is represented by the blue line, relative to what's going on with Indiana personal income, you can see how that arcing line of the gross gaming revenue, we are almost in 14, we are almost back to 2003's revenue level. And actually in 15, we're projecting that we will be below the 2003 level. Our forecast assumes that we bottom out during the biennium and then we remain stable after that. And obviously that's assuming no new competition or no additional changes in the current structure of the casino industry. As in all forecasts, there's threats and issues and impacts that could impact that forecast. We're concerned still about the poor labor market recovery, and I believe Mr. Handler talked about that in his presentation. We're concerned about the current recovery, and the current recovery exceeds the historic average recovery period. We're in our 73rd month of recovery right now. The average since 1945 between recessions is 58 months. So clearly we're beyond the period of when a recession is normally felt. The credit markets and improvements in household finances potentially has an impact on this forecast, as well as the continued uncertainty of the federal budgetary policy and the changing energy costs as well. So now to get to what everybody wants to see. The the forecast on sales tax in the current year, we are, compared to the December 13 forecast, we're adding $13.8 million to the forecast, and then we are growing it from there 4.1 and 4.7% in 16 and 17. Individual income tax, we're taking, the equations take out $158.4 million from the December forecast. From there, we're growing it at 1.0 and 2.7%. I would mention that those, as I stated previously, that those numbers incorporate any of the income tax rate reductions that have already been passed. So if you look at the underlying tax base of what's going on in the individual income, it's a growth of 2.8% and 3.7% in individual. Corporate, the equations add $57.3 million, grows 3.2% in 16, and decreases 1.6% in 17. Once again, when you adjust for the rates, the tax base for corporate would be going up 11.5 and 2.3%. In the gaming taxes, the equations take out an additional $49.6 million in the current fiscal year, and then continues a reduction of 4.4% in 16 and 0.8% in 17. And then all other taxes, the equations would add $7.9 million in the current year, and then an additional 0.3% growth in the first year, 0.8% growth in the second year. And then for total general fund revenues, the equations would remove $129 million out of the current year, and then grow total revenues by 2.4% in 16 and 3.2% in 17. And then in your packet, I know it's probably hard to see, but in your packet is the traditional worksheet that shows the individual numbers by the components of the tax revenues. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to defer all questions to Eric. I mean, take any of your questions.
Question. Well, thank you for your work, and thanks to all the members of the committee for their work on this. It's although the forecasts have been remarkably good in terms of percentages, other than the huge drop when nobody was able to stay up with the recession. They've been pretty close, but the problem is that even small, very small numbers represent tens of millions of dollars, and in some cases hundreds of millions of dollars to the state. So it requires quite a bit of refinement to stay on target. And I think the other thing to remember for all of us is that you need not to look at a single month revenue forecast as an identifier of where you think you are. You need to look at a compilation of a trend as being much more important to you if you're a person who wants to look at these numbers. Are there questions or comments about the forecast? So we would say this is a moderately positive forecast for the next 2 years at this point in time. And of course, we'll be preparing budgets based on these percentages. Cautiously optimistic, I guess, would be the watchword. Any other comments or thoughts on this? Any other members of the technical committee that want to make a comment about this? So we'll take your news and digest it and work on it and go to work, David. Thank you very much for your work. Thanks to John and Bill for being here and being parts of this. With that, Mr. Chairman, I think, is there other business? I think we stand adjourned for this. Is this a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year?